Hi, my name is Rachel Dixon. I'm a massage therapist and postural alignment therapist on Nantucket Island. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about low backs, and the rest of the backs in reference to the joint by joint approach that is Mike Boyle's and Gray Cook's theory. It's a different way of looking at different issues that people have. Today's information is really for informational purposes only. If there's any question about whether these exercises are safe for you to do, please do talk to your doctor about it. And you're also welcome to email me. This is also rather general information. It will work for most people, but it might be different for your specific issues, which is the other reason why it's always good to follow up with either me or another doctor to find out if this is specific for you. Please also feel free to ask lots of questions if you would like to. I've also been teaching enough classes that some of this information is overlapping each other. In other words, I've done several classes on low backs. They're each looking at different elements of what happens with the low back. So sometimes I will reference a previous class. Sometimes I will use some of the same information from a previous class. So sometimes going back to some of the previous classes can be helpful because I'll mention one little piece of it and the other class will have expanded more on it. But feel free to ask me any questions throughout the class, and I will try to make it as specific to you. But really, one of the reasons that we're talking about so much is that the body is really all attached to each other and it's all interrelated. So there were a few things that I think I was perhaps a little bit unclear of last week, and I just want to start by clearing those up. First of all joints are meant to move. And I say even the feet because a lot of people think of the feet as these solid things, but we were talking about some joints that had a purpose of mobility and some joints that had a purpose of stability. And that purpose is really in movement. But every joint is meant to move in the right amount. Some joints are meant to move more, and some joints are meant to move less. And a lot of times the injury happens if they're not working the way that they're meant to work. So the joint by joint approach is a systematic theory of approaching human body movement developed by strength coach Mike Boyle and physical therapist Gray Cook. And it's the foundation of efficient human movement in which alternating series of stable segments move on mobile joints. So every joint moves, but some joints are meant to be more stable and some joints are meant to be more mobile. And so this approach is really helpful when people end up showing up with injuries that didn't have a trauma associated with it. So if you go and do, if you're walking along and you got hit by a car, or you were in a car accident, or you had an accident, and sometimes even a slip and fall, that would accommodate, that would be a good reason for having an injury in this area. When you're just leaning over to make the bed, like you've always done for many, many years, and you get an injury, these are where these things show up where it more explains how an injury happened when there wasn't a trauma associated with it. It's also a really great way of preventing accidents or preventing these non-necessary incidents from happening and keeping our body a little bit more moving the way that we're meant to move. So last session, we looked at the relationship affecting the knee, which was really the hip and the ankle. And most often we're going to find that the joints that were affecting our body were mostly below it from a gravitational standpoint or more close to the body. So a lot of times when it comes to shoulder, the shoulder joint is going to create more issues down here if this isn't as stable as it ought to be. The same can happen with the hip, but when we're stacking our body on top of each other, it's very common that, you know, the ankles are a problem for the knee, and the hip, which is also close to the center of the body, can also produce an issue with that. Now, I forgot to reattach the body's picture of what was meant to be mobile and stable, but essentially in the joint by joint approach, we have these stacked opposite mobile and stable joints that work in functional movement. So the big toe is meant to be mobile. The ankle is meant to be stable. The knee is meant to be, the ankle is meant to be, let me start over again. Toe, big toe, mobile. The bottom of the foot, stable. The ankle, mobile. The knee, stable. And in case I hadn't made that clear, what does a stable knee look like? Stable knees should be able to move in flexion and extension, which is the movement they're meant to have, but they're supposed to be able to go in the plane that they're supposed to have. So the knees are supposed to be able to go forward and backwards without sort of collapsing in or moving out. So if I was flexing and extending my stable knee, it should track in a straight alignment. If my knee was having to go in and out because my ankle was locked up or my hip had issues, then it's not stable. The hip is 3 planes really, but this is meant to be mobile. But then we talked about how the hip might not be strong enough to keep the knee in alignment. So where that is going to play in, okay, is all the muscles of the lower leg, and there's really kind of like 4 sides around this knee. If these muscles are not strong enough to kind of keep that knee in alignment, then the knee is going to move like this instead of tracking sort of straight like this, okay? At the same time, the hip might be locked up, and that lock up is going to make the knee move because the hip doesn't have the ability to move in the planes that it's meant to look at. Now, when we're going to talk a little bit more about the back today, okay? We have a couple joints around the SI joint. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but our low back, which is right here, our lumbar back is meant to be stable. Even if we look at the joints of what the vertebrae look like, we know they're meant to be stable. They're large. They're meant for muscle attachments, and it's not. We have no rib cage around it. So, you know, the low back and then our muscles are really meant to support all of our organs. Then we have the thoracic area, which is this right here. It's the rib cage. And this is meant to be mobile. Our neck itself is meant to be stable, but the very last vertebrae, the occiput, the OA joint, the occiput and the Atlantis is meant to be mobile. And then if you look, you know, I put an element where I'm talking a little bit about shoulders today, and the scapula is meant to be stable. That's the wing bone right here over both the thoracic area, which is meant to be mobile, and the glenohumeral joint, which is meant to be mobile as well. Not really, I have talked about the shoulder joint. So today's I'm more referring to when the thoracic area has a problem being a little bit too tight. So these stable areas are really where most people get injured. So if you think about what happens when people say, oh my gosh, I have an injury, and it's anywhere between their tailbone and their ears. Can anyone think about some really common injuries or issues that people end up having? If anyone wants to raise their hand, they're welcome to and talk about it, or I can just name some. So really common for the low back. people will have either a type of arthritis, like a stenosis. And a stenosis is an arthritis where the canal of the inside of the vertebrae narrows a little bit. So it's an issue because there's less space for your spinal cord, and it ends up, it's not really anything that you can get rid of. So sometimes they might go through and surgically try to open it up a little bit, but sort of like opening up a can of worms. Also really common to have disc injuries in the low back. So the joint by joint approach that we're going to work at is very specifically for me as a massage therapist. When clients come into me and they say, I have a stenosis, or they say, I have, a disc injury in my back, or a history of a disc injury in the back, the joint by joint approach is a great way to deal with it. And we're going to talk a little bit about what to do with that, but a stenosis is often caused, not always, it can have a genetic component, but it's an element where that stable back was meant to be really stable all the time, and it moved too much. So there was the right amount for those joints to be able to move, and instead of moving the right amount, they moved a lot more because the hips typically did not move as much as they should. For a disc injury, not always, but a lot of times, the muscles on either side of the spine were not in balance. And so people would have more of an issue where one side was really functional, the other side was not. And then it was an unequal balance between the left and the right. And while it's great to deal with lots of elements of it, with most people, what we would do with the joint by joint approach that I'm going to talk about is a great way to deal with both of those issues. For the scapula, really, really common to have people with a shoulder injury that also have an imbalance in the muscles. So the scapula really is a winged bone, but it has really four sides and there's muscles attaching to all of it. And what's really common is one or two of the muscles are much stronger than the other two. So there's an imbalance. And today we're going to talk a little bit about muscle imbalances and how they work together to provide stability for something. So in the scapula area, we have these four rotator cuff muscles, and one of them, oftentimes a subscapularis, but not always, will be way stronger than the other three muscles. And then it's like a really dominant mom. You know, these relationships are like family members. There's often like a mom, a dad, a daughter, and a son, and they all have to play together and work together and get along with each other. But sometimes one will be a little bit of a bully. So oftentimes one, the subscapularis will be a little bit of a bully in that relationship. And because the scapula is no longer as stable as it ought to be, someone will end up getting injured because of those bullied muscles and the joints not working the way that they should. So the muscles sort of dominate what happens with the joints. When I talked about the four sides of the muscles of the lower leg and then how the hip and the knee were attached to each other, these relationships, if they're not sort of in an equal pattern, will also create the instability at the knee. And when we talk about the low back, I'm going to talk about how the core is involved, what the true core is. So the true core, when you think of your core, people think about their stomach, right? They think about how strong are my abdominal muscles? How many crunches can I do? And in functional movement, we actually have four sides of our core. And we have the deep transverse abdominis in the front and the back erectors in the back. But we also have the diaphragm on the top and the pelvic floor on the bottom. And these are all family members that have to get along and work together as a team to create an ideal core. An ideal core is going to be stable. It's going to be stacked on top of each other. And there's going to be an element where this is stable, but then as the appendages are moving, they're going to move as a team to create support. Any questions before I keep going? Okay, when we come to the neck, it's a little bit different than the muscles that play in together. It is common for like the sternocleidomastoid to be much tighter, but a lot of times people are on devices so much that we have a body that's not stacked properly. So our movement, so maybe the back of our neck is really working very hard to keep us from falling forwards, as opposed to really having an imbalance. So working on stacking properly and using devices properly can go a really long way with the neck injuries. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a sip of water. And then we can get straight into the low back. So how do we deal with it? So I'm going to address the low back. I'm going to address some scapula issues, and I'm going to address some neck issues. And we're going to address it as you could anything. And I like to give everyone a sense of figuring out how to work through your own issues. So we're going to increase mobility in the less mobile joints, and we're going to increase stability in the stable joints. And then we want to move in a safe, stable way. So we could increase mobility with stretching, foam rolling, or massage. And I believe we talked about this last time, but we would want to go deep, slow, 90 seconds or more, areas that either are tight or hold you back. So if you are going to stretch down and you feel either something is not giving when you're doing a stretch, that would be a good area to do it. Or simply when we discuss what areas might be affecting as you lean over to say, check your hip mobility, we can do that, okay? For increasing stability, we are going to work on different stability exercises to support the joints in alignment. And then we're going to put it to practical use. So everyone, all the information and the links that I have should have been emailed to everyone. And when we, and if you have questions, everyone can come email me afterwards and ask questions during the time. Please ask questions though, because a lot of times something will come up that I wasn't aware of. So when we talk about our low back is meant to be stable, and I already discussed, but the real core is that four-sided diaphragm, deep transverse abdominal muscles, the spina erectors, and the pelvic floor all working in connection with each other. Many different ways that you might be able to work on this, but one of the most basic and the best way of doing it is to work on aligning the body properly and then working on diaphragmatic breathing. And I did a whole class on this exact thing. So I did put the link to that class in this, but I'm going to demonstrate it together. So I'm going to demonstrate creating a bit of a stable back, and then we're going to look at how mobile are our hips and are they affecting that back. So oftentimes the hips are too stiff, okay? And you can think of like a cowboy. So either, and we'll look at actually how mobile they are, but in movements, okay, we have the cowboy walk, which our hips are really stiff. So I'm going to exaggerate it, but this is maybe how we walk, okay? So these would be hips that are too stiff, or we might be the Marilyn Monroe walk, okay? So Marilyn Monroe walk might look like this. And this is an element where there's a lot of sway in gait. And this could either be coming from a lot of laxity in the ligaments, and it might also be coming from laxity in the muscles, not keeping the joint in a stable position. In either of these scenarios, the back joints themselves, the actual vertebrae, move more than the ideal amount. And this commonly causes issues like stenosis or perhaps a disc injury. So to start with, let me show you a very shortened version of what I did in the breathing class, which is one of my favorite end of the day or even start of the day exercises called static back. You can use a chair, a coffee table, or anything else. We're going to get down to the ground, and I'm going to place my feet up on this chair, and I'm just going to rest my back down, and I'm going to put my arms out to the side, and I'm just going to relax. Then I'm going to work on breathing. Something to note is I'm totally at rest. I've got relatively right angles here. If I have rotations in my hips or my shoulders, I might feel that, I might not, but most likely gravity itself against the ground is going to allow my pelvis to create better alignment, my shoulders to have better alignment, and my head to come back. So this is like sitting up, but with the ground making sure that I'm in proper alignment. So as we sit up all day long and we have, a forward posture, this allows us to reverse what we did negatively all day long. If you find that you have a really rounded shoulder and your head is up here and then it's sort of your chin is more towards the ground because of the rounded back, you could put a pillow or something under your head because you do want to have your head relatively in alignment. So while we sit here watching a show, listening to music, or just resting, we can work on diaphragmatic breathing. So now we're relatively stacked up, and we're going to focus on breathing that is really going to get into our stomach. Okay, so we could even place our hands on the stomach. Ideal breathing is also going to be in and out the nose, long inhale, but longer exhale, relatively silent, tongue on the roof of the mouth, teeth apart, but lips together. I'm not going to be able to talk and do all of that, so I'm not going to do that, but we're going to breathe in a really long inhale. I would feel my stomach perhaps rise just a little bit. I would also potentially feel my rib cage expand out a little bit right here. If I was not on my back, I might feel my back expand a little bit as well. And we're going to breathe into a long inhale and breathe out to a longer exhale and perhaps swallow. So this is a really great way to create a stacked back, and the diaphragm work itself is going to create a stable back. So we also want to create that stable back on top of a stacked back. So it's a really great way to be able to do both of those. So any questions on creating a stable back before I move on to how mobile our hips are? Okay, so talking about the hip mobility, I talked a little bit about in the last class, different tests that we might be able to say if we say, I have no idea if my hips are really mobile or if they're not. And I'm going to review those a little bit, but say we were the cowboy, okay? If we had the cowboy walk, which is a little bit more of, it might engage, look, I'm going to exaggerate it, but we don't have the space to like flex and extend. So we're going to potentially look like we're walking like this, okay? Super exaggeration here. If we walked like that, we could come down and do a test. And that test to see how mobile our hips look like might look like this. So if we got down on the ground, I could put my feet together and I could lie down and do this or sit up. You can sit up in a chair too. And you can say, okay, so how much can my hips come down to the side? And you might find if you were sitting on a chair, right, that your hips come down and they kind of go like this. You know, they're like kind of angled up here and you're like, oh, this is as far down as my hip goes. And or you could look at, you know, sort of how much this hip is able to move across this way. These are other ways that we can look at. So really common that if someone were to have the cowboy walk, you might have a hard time sort of opening the hips up like this, okay? Really common as the hips come out in this frog, that my low back is going to pull a little bit. That is good. That is actually what we want to be able to see. So if you had trouble where you were sitting in that chair, you had more of a cowboy walk, and not even necessarily all the cowboy walk. You might find that one side is tighter than the other, and you're still going to potentially want to do these, okay? But you come to, you know, sit in a number 4, and we're sitting up on our sit bones, and instead of relatively having the ability to not only bring this leg here, but move my body forward, okay? If you find yourself, wow, this is, you know, I'm somewhere not as flexible on that side, and or you don't match to relatively both sides, you might want to do these upcoming exercises. So the exercises that I'm going to demonstrate are supine femur rotations, assisted hip lift, and knee drops. So supine femur rotations are one of my favorite exercises. A lot of times the ligaments and tendons and or junk happens in the hip joint, okay? So a lot of junk, if you had a frozen shoulder, that is literally a buildup of some sort of junk in your shoulder joint that is going to limit the ability to actually move. It's like sticky junk that keeps it there, okay? The same thing can happen in the hip. And also the hip wants to be stable. So if the hip joint is not stable enough, it will suck in the femur head to try to create stability where it's not stable. So quite often if you have the femur here, the femur is this bone right here, into the hip joint, okay, I'm going to ask that the femur move in both directions and kind of like unstick that femur joint, okay? How we can do it, there's more than one way of doing it, but I love the supine femur rotations because now I'm gonna lie on my back. I'm gonna take this leg out of it and just do stable. I'm gonna create an active leg. So instead of just totally flopping like this, it's a straight leg. My toes are pointing up, and I'm gonna move my whole leg the movement is coming from the hip. It's not that my foot is moving side to side. My whole leg is gonna move as a unit, and I'm gonna roll it inside to outside. And there's not necessarily a lot of movement when you do this. And you're going to sort of move from side to side. And this is going to be like asking that to unstick this femur. On this side, it's going to look like this. You can do it sitting up and save yourself the time, okay? If you sit up and save yourself the time, you want to make sure you have that extended back. So I don't want to be slumped like this when I do it. So I'm going to put my hands here. I'm going to sit up onto my hip bones, and then I'm going to work double like this. And I'm a little tight today, so it's a little less ideal for me to do the double, although the double saves time. And anything that you're going to do that is both going to save time and make it more possible for you to do is going to be helpful. So that's where we're going to start with unsticking that hip joint that might be a little stuck. And then we're going to stretch into the hip joint. So I really like the assisted hip lift. A couple ways that we could do it. You can either do it in a supine position. So I'm lying down here. I'm going to put this knee over, and I'm going to work to open up this hip joint right here. And I'm just going to rest my upper body and actively look to use my muscles to get a little bit of a stretch. Really effective after we've loosened up that femur to work on this if you're tight into this area. And/or, especially if it is the anterior part of the hip that has the problems, we can come up to the wall, put our foot on. So now we have more of a right angle right here, which actually means that our stretch is going to be more towards the anterior. So now I'm going to put my foot over and I'm going to stretch out like this. Now, if you find that you're tight enough that your butt is up off the ground to have a right angle, you want to scoot back so that you can put this foot over and stretch this, and you're not in the air, okay? It's good to have a right angle on the leg up on the wall, but you don't have to have it. You do need to be able to have sort of both butt cheeks on the ground. And then the third exercise is knee drops. So I really love knee drops because they're working on flexion and extension at both the SI joint and the hips, while working in sort of a little bit of a mobility. So we are going to be lying on the ground with our feet. We're not going to be collapsing our ankles. We're going to be moving along the edges of the foot because the movement's going to be coming from the hips, not at the ankle. So we're going to collapse to one side, get to the ground. This is purposeful, not collapsing really, but we're going to move to the other side, and we're going to get a little bit of a stretch into our back. And if you don't go all the way to the ground, that's okay. But what you do is you see how far you can go and then add a little bit of pressure into the ground to see if you can stretch that way. So this is asking actually your hips to move opposite of each other, because one is moving in internal rotation and one is working in external rotation. And this is a really great way. So the three exercises that I've given for the tight hips, the cowboy hips, are the unsticking with the supine femur rotations, stretching with the assisted hip lift, and then working with alternating sort of a little bit of a mobility sequence with the knee drops. So if you had more of the Marilyn Monroe, things were not strong enough, you might try side planks or some sort of a leg lift, okay? Because that means that you aren't necessarily strong enough right here to keep stable. You kind of want to get out of this plane. So not great at side planks, but if you were to go on a side plank, and you can't really see with my shirt, but you don't want to collapse into here, you want to create where you're asking those side plank muscles to engage for you. Last time I also showed where you could stand and do some muscles like this. This is a little bit more the glute and the lower leg muscles, but it definitely would help with the Marilyn Monroe type hips as well. Then you can advance it with half kneeling rotations. So this is where asking our body to move. This is the moving better stably, okay? So this is standing. This is half kneeling, okay? And when I'm half kneeling, I've got my pubic symphysis, well, not my hip joints right now. I kind of want one knee tracking under this hip and this knee under this hip right here. So you can just start by simply resting. This is asking one hip to stabilize and balance. You can also lift your leg if you want to, but just resting right here and then adding an element of movement to it. You could have like a band right here, and we're going to ask, I'm not moving this is keeping stable, but I'm going to move my back and my core on top of those stable hips. And ideally I would turn around to work the other side, because I'm going to ask the rotation. So I'm asking my body to stay stable in these hips while I'm going to add both a rotation and movement into it. Any questions on the low back before I get into the scapula thoracic area? Okay, so scapula thoracic area, practically speaking, of the issues that I see when people come in, they usually complain of, oh, I have tension right here. And, I have a couple, I'm really tight right in here. And this is often what I find, okay? In these days of extended computer and devices, people have really rounded upper backs with oftentimes the head forward. This is where the head's going to play in with, the neck stuff is going to play in with the thoracic stuff. The bones, instead of getting stacked right on top of each other, relatively, the thoracic is supposed to be a little rounded, but not at this rounded. The bones are supposed to be stacked up more than forward, and there will be, if there's instability or certain things have to work too hard, there's going to be a lockdown of a few ribs that doesn't feel good, particularly if the scapula is not stable. So I will often find that subscapularis or something, the scapula is winging, the scapula is too far out from where it's supposed to be. And now we don't have the stability in the scapula for all the movement we're doing with our arms, and our thoracic area is gonna lock down and to be able to create some stability for it. But it tends to be really uncomfortable for people. So how can you work on it? One of the best ways that I find when people have their vertebrae too stacked forwards and really tight into, they have a tight back and they're really rounded, okay, is for just the thoracic area, not the low back, okay? It's to take a roll towel. So this is a roll, but it's like a roll towel, okay? I'm gonna put it under the rib cage, not under the low back, okay? And I'm just gonna lie down and I'm going to rest on this and then just breathe. And particularly where I'm stuck, I'm gonna lie on it for a couple of minutes and then I'm going to move it up. And what this is really gonna do is it's a very small amount where those vertebrae are stuck forward and they're gonna open them up a little bit. So it kind of gets that, the stuck thoracic area to move a little bit better. And then I really like cobra on elbows to extend the upper back. So now we have an issue where our back, we've gotten a little bit more mobility to it, but the muscles are a little bit tighter here, and we are, we're leaning over like this still. So a lot of times our muscles to extend our back or to sit more upright aren't working as well as they should. So this can be hard. Any of the cobras can be hard if you have a low back. So this should not hurt and stop if it does, okay? But you can get on your stomach. You can kind of give pigeon toes for your feet. Let me see if I can, I'm gonna take my feet out of it so you guys can see my upper body though, okay? I'm going to have my elbows sort of pressing into the ground, okay? And I'm going to I'm not going anywhere, but I'm gonna be pushing out like this. So now I'm gonna keep my neck neutral, okay? So now I'm going to do this cobra where I'm not going anywhere, but I've created a lot of activity between my shoulder blades, and my neck is neutral, but I am working into the muscles between my shoulder blades in extension. So what that looks like from the side, again, taking my feet out of it, right? Which feet are supposed to be neutral. This should not hurt your low back. If it does, stop. But I'm going to keep my neck neutral. So I'm not going to have my neck up like this. I'm not going to have my neck down like this. My neck is neutral. My elbows are pressed into the ground. I've created a lot of activity by not going anywhere, but pressing out towards this. And I'm going to stay in this position. Breathing is helpful. This is actually going to get a little bit into my low back as well. The breathing into the back, I should say. I'm going to create a little activity right here. Whew. And then to improve the arm stability, I'm going to do arm circles. So I'm going to show you arm circles kneeling, okay? Rachel? You can do arm circles standing, you can do arm circles sitting. What can be helpful if I'm doing it kneeling, okay, is that I'm also asking my hips to be able to stabilize as well, okay? And when I'm standing, my toes can grip a lot, and I might not be asking my hips to work as much. So I'm going to create an active hand. I'm going to put my arms out. I'm going to squeeze my shoulder blades together, and I'm going to make little circles towards my thumbs, towards the front. My body is rocking somewhat side to side, front to back, actually, not side to side. And then I'm going to switch and point my thumbs back, and I'm going to do the muscles in the opposite. So now the circles are going towards the back. And this is where I'm asking my hips to work, and I'm asking the muscles of the scapula to work properly to be able to support my scapula. Any questions before I talk a little bit about the neck?
Rachel, when you were doing the arching, the lying down on your stomach and then up on your elbows, were you arching your back at all in the movement, or just breathing and holding the position?
No. My back was relaxing. I mean, there is an arch to my back, but my back was neutral, meaning I wasn't trying to arch my back, okay? What I was trying to do is get the muscles to work, activity in the upper back where the lower back was relaxed.
Okay.
There is a link literally it will be a video, a talking through, and pictures of what I did as well in your PDF. It's not a PDF, it was a Word document that you guys would have. Okay, so the neck. So a lot of times that neck and that thoracic area are going to have an issue together because of the placement of where the head is in space, okay? So ideally, our whole body is meant to be relatively stacked on top of each other. In today's world, tons of computers and devices, we tend to have a rounded shoulder, and we're just not going to have a rounded shoulder and not have an issue into our neck as well. So we want to make sure that our head is in the proper placement, and therefore, if our head is over like this, our muscles are overworking. There's also an element where they can overwork or have a problem left to right. This one's a little bit more positional, what I'm going to talk about today. But we really want to initially think about stacking our body properly, and where are we unstacked from. So I've done whole classes on this. I didn't actually put those links into it, but I've done multiple classes that played in a little bit with this. So if our neck is too far forward of where it's supposed to be, we want to figure out where the issue is. A lot of people will be like, oh, I just need to, do these neck tucks to get our neck back. But if our issue is really coming from down below, we want to make sure that we're addressing it from the correct position. And let me show you why. Really, really common, okay, for two positions. Let me see if I can get more of my whole body. really common that you're not going to see my lower body, but you'll see my upper body, that we have a forward head position, either because this is back and we're sort of like this, okay? So my pelvis is pretty much where it should be, but my upper back isn't, my head isn't, and my neck is going to come up like this, or I'm going to move a lot like this because my head's in the wrong position. What's almost more common nowadays is that my pelvis, instead of being stacked over my knees and my ankles, slips forward. So now I have much more curve in my back. My center of gravity, my pelvis area, is loaded over my midfoot. My upper back is back. This makes my head look like it's in ideal alignment, but it's not because of what's going down on right here. If I bring my pelvis back, I suddenly have that more rounded forward. So forward head. So some people who have this pelvis forward and they're here, they're like, oh my gosh, I just need to do neck tucks. But neck tucks are not the right thing. What we want to do is create more stability in the pelvis area. And I have a whole class on these things that I had done in the past. But in the ideal world, figure out where your alignment is having a problem down below and fix it typically down below. For the most part, you're going to want to work on stacking the body. And with most people, static back, which I showed you at the beginning, would be very helpful for it. And then once we've kind of gotten the body to be stacked properly, we want to move the body in flexion and extension like cat and dog. So it's like cat camel as well. You can do it sitting as well, but you can get down to the ground carefully. You can be on all fours. And I'm essentially going to work on flexion and extension of the whole body. With most people, okay, they move a lot here. They don't move thoracic area. So maybe when I come into extension, I'm going to move into extension and I'm going to really sink between my shoulder blades and I'm going to really focus on the areas where I don't move as well as other ones. All right. Any questions? I'm pretty much done with the material. So any questions? We have maybe like 8 or 9 minutes left.
I have a neck question.
Okay.
What is the best way to sleep for your neck? I never know. It's like hard pillow, soft pillow, no pillow, pillow with a hole in the middle. Like I feel like sometimes I get up and my neck is just stiff and sore because I've slept on it wrong.
Mm-hmm. So if you've slept on it wrong, it's probably more than just your pillow. There's probably stuff of throughout the day. Different people have different thought processes on pillows, beds, and things like that. Okay. Head at the minimum, you want your head in alignment. So, you know, when you look at how much space there is between here, if you were sleeping on your side, okay, or if you were on your back and you have less space, it kind of changes from side to side. So for the most part, I would try to keep your head relatively in neutral alignment with the pillows that you had, okay? And also, depending on the type of pillow, your head might actually be like this more than kind of in alignment like this. So in theory, keeping your head more in alignment is going to be better. Katie Bowman, who does like all the dynamic aging, and I do a lot of other classes, she's a big proponent that we are not using nighttime to work on our mobility throughout the day. She believes in like mats on the ground and no pillows, and that we wake up like, because we weren't as comfortable all night long, we've actually moved a lot all night long. And I don't know how I really feel about that. I don't know, but in today's world, we almost always are a little bit more fluffy and comfortable. So at least we want to think about keeping alignment while we're sleeping, potentially being open to the thought of movement, or what are we doing during the day that's making our neck get stiff at nighttime. But Katie has some interesting things that are totally different than that. She's a big proponent of like no pillow, and you get 8 or 9 hours at night to kind of work on being uncomfortable and moving all over and getting a lot of extra movement at nighttime.